Wow, thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning when there's lots of sickness going around, and January is not a very thrilling time of the year. As we always say in our family, the worst day of the year is December 26th. It's like after all the expectation that it's over, and then we face January and February, which are pretty depressing months, right? But I'm so glad that you are all here. Both Caroline and Kyle have been dear friends for probably a decade or so, and I come down to Dallas, Fort Worth area a lot. But I was so glad to be able to join with you, and I'm glad you're here. So there's a handout, and I didn't know that we were going to give the book away. That's amazing as well. I am going to be talking about several things from this particular book. And again, just follow along in the handout as well. And I know this is kind of small, but we'll try to show you this as well. And I want to open with just a question, and that is really, what do these people all have in common? Kind of hard to see there, but that's Nick Offerman, right, of Ron Swanson fame. Jordan Peterson. Who all knows who Jordan Peterson is? Okay, I thought maybe more people. A very spicy and very famous psychologist / philosopher that has had a big impact on a lot of people. You probably don't know that Nick's book, Alain de Botton. It's called Artist Therapy, but also, and that's another book by him, Religion for Atheists. Question is, and we could throw some other people in there as well. We could throw Oprah and Warren Buffett and some older people, like Marie Kondo, we could throw in here. And the question is, what do all those kind of people have in common? Well, the answer is that they are all gurus. That is, they are all people who are offering to other people a particular way of living and seeing the world that promises true happiness. Right? That's really what a guru does, whether it's in finance, or whether it's CrossFit, some CrossFit person or Peloton or whatever it is, or Nick Offerman. This is a book I read of his a couple years ago called Paddle Your Own Canoe, and it's basically a philosophy of life that includes a lot of sex and barbecue, and that's how you find life, basically, and woodworking, right? But every one of these people is saying, this is how you can find true life. This is what a guru does, and that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong. There's good in every one of these books, because we do need wisdom and we do need help from each other. And there are always people who have an expertise, whether it's in finance or in exercise or in simplification of your life or whatever it is, or pastry chefing, that can help us, the people that can lead us to see things and do things in a way differently than we do. Now, if we took these people, though, and added some other names into this mix and asked the same question, it might feel a little confusing. So if we took Oprah and Nick Offerman, all these, and we added to this list Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Seneca, you've probably heard those names or most of those names. That to us would sound really weird. What do those people have to do with these people? But the reality is that those are actually exactly what these people were in the ancient world as well. They were gurus. I know when you think of philosophy, you probably think of it like I did up until just a few years ago, really. I remember my philosophy 103 class at a public university, and I had this crazy old guy, Dr. Brown, who would have like chalk all over his clothes, and he had one shirt part tucked out, and he would walk around and write furiously on the board and then turn around, and often he would lecture like this. I mean, he was just in his own world, and he would talk about all these things. And basically, I left this class as a young 18-year-old. I'd just become a Christian at the university through Campus Crusade. And the questions he was asking, like, when you leave the room, does a chair exist? And how would you know that, right? And so the whole class was just this kind of esoteric things that I had no idea what was going on, right? So I didn't come away from that class, and maybe the fault was largely mine. I don't know. Looking back, he may have been saying the right things and I just didn't have ears to hear. But I have never thought that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Seneca had anything to do with my life, right? I mean, they're not gurus. They're going to help me fix anything. But the reality is that that's exactly who they were. They were gurus in the ancient world, offering to people a certain way of seeing the world so that they might experience true happiness and flourishing. That's why the Greeks and the Romans, to some degree, did philosophy. They weren't just interested in big ideas that have nothing to do with anything. They were interested in big ideas, but it's because they realized those big ideas affect how you actually live your life. They come all the way down. And that's what they were. And really, what all of these people are asking, especially these ancient people, to some degree these people, some better than others, but what these ancient people were asking were actually the great human questions. And this is on your handout is there as well, if this is a little too small to see. But that is, there are universal human questions that we humans, as long as we've been thinking, have always asked ourselves. And we can kind of categorize them into groups. One is like, what's the nature of reality? How do things really work? What does it mean to be human? What's the difference between male and female? How did this all come to be? What's the true origin story of the world? Was it a big bang or a creation or some kind of evolutionary pattern, whatever it was? And all those questions we can sum up in a word a big fancy word called metaphysics. That is kind of what is the nature of reality and how did it come to be and how do things interact with each other, okay? This was a huge question for the likes of Aristotle and Plato. They had very distinct ideas about what the nature of reality was. And for them, that really mattered because metaphysics is foundational to these other issues. The second one was, how do we know things? Like, maybe you've never asked yourself that, but there's a big fancy word for that called epistemology. But actually, it's affecting your daily life, whether you realize it or not. How do you know whom to trust? And why do you believe the things you do? Why are you committed to living in certain ways or another? And how do you know what's right? And how did you, if you've ever changed your mind on something, how did that come about? These are the kind of questions that ancient philosophers thought and talked a lot about, and they still talk about these things, and we can call them epistemology. And all of that leads into really the two most important issues. Those are really foundational to these other questions is, what is the good? What's the good life? What is good? What is right? And how do you actually live according to that? And a big part of that is this fourth question, then how do we structure society in terms of its relationships? We can call this politics. I know for us, politics is a very negative word, and it is a negative word. It's a negative reality. But the idea of politics relates to like the polis. What is the city or the gathering of people? How do you, metropolitan, you can hear that in it, right? So when you gather together and live together in relationships, what's the best way to do that? What's the way to relate to each other individually, in smaller groups, in relationship of humans to government, etc.? So these questions are ones that we can and do ask ourselves, but it turns out this is exactly what all ancient people were thinking about and asking as well. The great ancient philosophers had all kinds of much more sophisticated views actually than most of these people do. But the biggest critique I think we could make of these people is that they really are only trying to answer a very small slice of the truth. The people that get closest to it, certainly Nick Offerman, it's an enjoyable enough book to read. He's definitely had a Christian past that he's fighting against, and so his things he says about Christianity are not very pleasant. But Jordan Peterson, he's attempting to offer a kind of big view of humanity and how to live. Alain de Botton, you've probably not heard of, is in a lot of ways as well. But most of the time, modern people, Warren Buffett or Marie Kondo or something, they're not going to give you a kind of a whole philosophy of life. But that's what the ancient people did. They were very smart, and they were trying to help us figure out how to live. Now, you may be saying, I thought we were here to talk about the Bible and theology. Saturday morning, what am I doing here? Well, here's why this matters. Because when we go to the Bible, what we need to realize, and what it took me a long time to realize, is that actually the Bible is presenting itself in dialogue with and claiming to be superior to these exact same questions. Because these are the universal human questions that everybody does and should care about because they affect how you actually live your life. Whether you realize it, you do have a metaphysic. You do have an epistemology, you do have an ethic, and you do have a politic. It may or may not be very thought through, but we all have that, right? And it turns out that when we go to the Bible, it is exactly trafficking in those very same ideas. So just think about it. So does this whole idea, these big questions, have anything to do with Christianity and the Bible? I think yes. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is this, that the Bible is more than a philosophy for sure, in the sense that it is making claims that go beyond the claims of Jordan Peterson's book or Alain Baton or whoever, de Baton. It is claiming to be a revelation of God's own wisdom and to change our lives. I mean, it is a religion. Christianity is a religion. But even though it's more than a philosophy, I'd suggest to you today, it's not less than a philosophy. Any person reading the Old and New Testaments in the ancient world would have realized, in a way that we don't, that it is offering itself as an alternative answer, the true answer to these very same questions that Plato and Aristotle and all the way up to today were trying to answer as well. That it is, in fact, giving answers. So look, we can even think about this together, but does the Bible have a metaphysic? Does it have a way in which it's describing how things came to be and what the nature of reality and how the world works? Right? Which, there's lots of other cosmologies in the world. Does the Bible have a cosmology? Well, obviously it does. I mean, it's got the ultimate origin story, right? Right at the beginning, the Genesis, where everything, how things come to be. And it starts with this claim that actually is pretty crazy in the ancient world, that there's a singular God who has made everything out of love and out of his very essence. He's poured himself out. And that the apex of his creation, he stamped his very own image on and cares about them as his creatures. Humans aren't, like it is for a lot of ancient philosophies and religions, they're not just slaves to serve the gods and to cut up animals and give them, that they are actually stamped with his image, and he cares for them and has a loving relationship, a fatherly relationship with them. And then it explains what humans are, what the difference between male and female, how they are simultaneously differentiated and together are the image of God, right? And also how things came to get messed up, right? That a big part of the metaphysical reality of the Bible is that there was a disruption to this story. And so that what the time we're living in now is not like it was designed to be and not like it's going to be. All of that, friends, is a very nuanced and sophisticated metaphysic. It is answering the question that we all really need to know and really care about. Now, does the Bible have an epistemology? This one may sound, more weird, but think with me about how much of a theme of knowledge is in the Bible. How much knowing there is. And you may know that the word knowing in the Bible, like in most ancient cultures and most cultures today, is a richer word than how we mean it. For us, it just means kind of cognitive acquisition of information. But knowing can be referred, as you may know, to like sexual intimacy and all kinds of knowing. So it is a deeper word, but it is a theme that is all throughout the Bible. The knowledge of God. And it's not just a simplistic theme, it's a very nuanced theme again, because the idea is that the story of the Bible is very much about people knowing God, forgetting God, not seeing, knowing him clearly, and then coming to know him again. I mean, if you just kind of looked at the theme, the whole story of the Bible from a perspective of knowing, you'd see that's a pretty big thread that goes through the entire Bible of knowing God or not knowing God and the effects of that. And a big part of the story of the knowledge of God is the fact that it is a gift that he graciously reveals himself to us. That in other words, the Bible is offering a very thoughtful epistemology. How do we come to know? We come to know through revelation and through doing what he says. Like as we do, so we come to understand more. This is a big part of the Bible's epistemology, right? Does the Bible have an ethic? Well, that one's, I think, pretty obvious, right? This is what God does. He is constantly telling us what is the true, the good, and the beautiful. And he's giving that in the series of covenantal relationships that in the Old Testament called Torah, in the New Testament called the law of Christ. It's a revelation of God saying, this is the way to live that will promise you true human flourishing. This is what you long for, to be aligned with what is true and good and beautiful. And when you live that way, you will find life itself. And then finally, does the Bible have a politic? Now, again, I know the Bible and politics in the same sentence is a fraught sentence, but yes, it does. Think about how much of the Bible is telling us about relationships, both between government and humans, but also especially between humans with each other, both Old and New Testament. There is so much emphasis on the way that we need to relate to each other and the kind of structures we have in relationship to each other. So the point, friends, is that when we ask of the Bible these very central, beautiful, and important life-driving questions, we find that the Bible not only is seeking to answer them, but is giving very thoughtful, very sophisticated, and we would say ultimately true answers. And this leads then, and this is what the title of the book even given as well, leads to this very kind of odd title that my publisher didn't want to originally use because it sounds so weird. But now you don't have a choice to buy it. You've been given it, so there you go. But the question is Jesus then a philosopher? It's a very odd sounding thing, but it's only odd sounding if you and I are still thinking about our crazy philosophy professor who is dealing with things that have nothing to do with actual real life. But when you think about a philosopher in the ancient world, with the Bible as philosophy itself, as being one who gives you the wisdom to think about what the nature of reality is, how you come to know that, how to live accordingly, and then how to live in relationship with each other. Yes, that's exactly what Jesus' teachings are all about. And it turns out that it's only been in the last maybe 400 years or so that we've stopped thinking about Jesus this way. Throughout almost all of the church's history, this was one of the main titles given for Jesus, is that he is a philosopher. And I know that sounds weird. And when you get a chance to look in the book, you'll see the opening story I give is this imagined situation. Let's say you go into First Baptist of wherever, some huge church here in one of these in the metropolitan area, and you go in and they've got these like beautiful hand-sewn banners that say like, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Friend of Sinners, whatever. Well, there's a couple of them that I think we would be really shocked. First, if one of them said exorcist, we would probably be a little shocked, right? Even though that's clearly one of the main things Jesus is presented as. So I'm not recommending you do that at Mosaic or wherever, but that would be a fair banner to have exorcist on there. But one that I guarantee you're not going to find anywhere in any modern church is philosopher. If you walked into a church and that said philosopher is one of the names of Jesus, you'd think, what weirdness is going on here, right? But the reality is that is exactly how Christians have thought and talked and painted Jesus as a philosopher forever. In fact, one of the places you can see this, these may be too small to see, this is true all across sacred art and architecture, etc. But here's some interesting picture. This one is an interesting picture from this 3rd century city, very prosperous city that we now call Dura Europos, and it's just in ruins that was covered up. It was destroyed in the 3rd century and then covered up by the sands of time, literally, and was lost. And then when it was discovered in the early 20th century, we found a completely intact house or synagogue in the city and a completely intact house church because of the way it had been preserved. And it's very interesting, and this is not atypical. You have in the synagogue, Moses, that's a picture of Moses, who's being presented clearly as a philosopher. Like, I don't know if you ever thought about it, maybe from watching The Chosen or whatever, but the reason we think of Jesus wearing a robe usually is because he's being depicted as a philosopher. It's not just that those were convenient apparel or something, that they're usually and there are particular things like the way they stand with one hand out, the haircut indicates a philosopher usually. It'd be like if somebody walked in here, and you guys know this, better than where I live in Kentucky, but somebody walked in here with a tall hat, silver spurs and a big silver gun. I don't know what that would communicate here. I know what it communicates to me. I'd be freaked out, but maybe you would be like, welcome, that's, normal or something. But either way, you would know that that apparel and haircut or whatever communicates something. When I was in high school, I had hair down the middle of my back and played in a heavy metal band and wore, pentagrams on torn up jeans, right? When I walked into someplace, it was pretty clear what my identity was, right? I mean, I was trying to, this is how we use our hair and our apparel to communicate something. Well, in the ancient world, there were very clear ways you indicated who was a philosopher, right? By their haircut and this Moses being depicted as a philosopher, this is harder to see, but in all the paintings that are in the wall of this Europa city, in every one of them in the house church, Jesus is being presented as a philosopher while he's healing people, not while he's teaching, certainly. And when you start looking in the literature, this is a main way that they talked about Jesus, and we've almost completely lost it. Now, the question is, were they right to do that? Well, I think very clearly. If you can just think with me for a minute about, and this is the point, Jesus, the philosopher in the New Testament, just a few quick bullet points to help you see that this is indeed how Jesus was understood in the New Testament itself. The very fact that you have, what takes up the most real estate in the New Testament and what starts off the New Testament? Well, this fourfold biography about Jesus. That's what it is. The tetraeuangelion is the technical term for it, the gospel biography in four voices, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, together seen as providing this comprehensive, beautiful, dialogical biography of Jesus. Well, why did you write a biography in the ancient world? Well, you wrote a biography in the ancient world, a Greek biography like these, so that you could present to someone somebody worth emulating, or maybe somebody worth avoiding, but usually somebody worth emulating. And especially, you would write a biography of a great teacher or great philosopher for two reasons. So that you could have a repository of their teachings in one place, and so that you could see if they lived a good life or not. Because unlike us for today, where you could be a great, brilliant MIT professor in some field or anywhere, any university, and your moral life could be a disaster. It doesn't really matter as long as you're brilliant. In the ancient world, it totally mattered whether your philosophy matched your life. One of the ways Seneca, a great philosopher, said it is, no one wants a seasick captain, right? And that's exactly right. You don't want to follow someone's philosophy of life. You're going to orient your life around it if they're not actually living it themselves and are a model of it. So you write a biography so that you can learn those two things. Is this person worth it? What do they say? And how do they live? And if you go to the Gospels, you'll see that's exactly what they are about. They are constantly giving Jesus' teachings that are, if you look at it through these lenses, very metaphysical, very epistemological, very ethical, and very political. And they're saying, and here's how he lived. Here's how he interacted with people. What did he think about children? Did he, spit on them? No, he loved them. He welcomed them, and he said to adults, you have to be like this, right? What do you think about women? Right? What do you think about poor people? What do you think about sick and ostracized people? How do you interact with them? That's a huge part of understanding who Jesus is seeing these stories. It's not just the doctrines we believe about him, it's who was he as a person. Because friends, our Christian faith is not primarily based on a book. We do have a Bible that matters a lot. It's based on a person, that we believe God became a human, and the book points us to truly and inerrantly and faithfully who that person is. But our faith is not in the book. Our faith is in the person that's being pointed to. So it matters what he was like and what he said. And that's why you write a biography. That's why the New Testament starts with this very lengthy biography that has way more weight in the history of the church than the letters that are written afterwards, just because it matters who he was and what he said. And then when you dig into these, you see that one of the main ways Jesus is presented is as a sage, as a wise teacher. And that's what a philosopher is. After all, philosophia means a lover people now or something, right? But for them, what a philosopher was a sage. And you start thinking about all the ways Jesus shows up as wise, right? Think about the parables that he teaches, which invite you to kind of see things totally differently, see the world differently. You think about the interactions he has with the highly educated people of his day, where at the end of it, they're like, oh my, we don't even know what to say anymore, because we're the educated ones, and he has just run circles around us intellectually and morally, right? And you think about the ways that, in a lot of ways, he's like Solomon in this sense that he just, no pun intended with Solomon and the baby story, but he cuts through it, which is the whole point, is that he, if you know that story from Solomon, he's a wise king. And in fact, this is one of the main ideas of how important it is for a king in the ancient world. A king had to be wise. I know when you and I think king, we think crowns, gold. I wonder how much money they make a year. You know, that's what we think of, you know, pretty places they live. In the ancient world, what mattered for a king is that they're actually a person of great wisdom so that they can actually lead well. Solomon being the ultimate example of that, right? This son of David. And now, how do the Gospels present Jesus? Wow, it's amazing. They present him as this king who is wise. Friends, that's a philosopher. That's what he is being presented as very much. There's other things we could say as well. So, you can see on the handout there, so what does this matter? And this is what this book that you have in your hands is unpacking here. Well, I think by losing this idea of Jesus as a philosopher, that I think what's happened to us as Christians today is that often our Christian faith is really disconnected from other aspects of our lives. Like we have Jesus for the religious part of our lives, and that's maybe a big drawer in the chest of drawers of our life, you know, that's important. So maybe it's the top drawer even, or close up there, you know. But then we have these other people we go to understand all kinds of other things. And that's not entirely wrong. I mean, there are experts that help us with various things. But do you think about your Christianity as a whole life philosophy, or do you think about it as a really important part of your life? Or do you think of it as actually how you are seeking to inhabit the world? That's the question. Secondly, I think then related to this, we look to alternative gurus to give us the wisdom needed. So we go to all kinds of other people expecting that that's the only place we're going to find like the really practical stuff. Christianity is good for my, you know, what I do on Sunday and my faith and belief in God and my eternal home or something. But the good life, well, you know, that's based on a bunch of wisdom I get from Peloton or wherever, right? Which is fine. I'm not anti-Peloton. But do you think about your Christianity as offering a vision of the good life? Third, this is very interesting. I think we've stopped asking a set of big questions that Holy Scripture is actually seeking to ask. I don't know if any of you are Douglas Adams fans, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Does that ring any bells? Like three weirdos in the back. One of them was Kyle. When I was an adolescent, those were early influences on my humor and understanding. Obviously, it worked real well. But what happens in these Hitchhiker Guide, they're like these weird comedic science fiction stories. And they're very ironic, you know. And one of the things that happens is that it turns out the Earth was a massive computer that was just designed to answer the question of the meaning of life. And so at the end of it, it turns out they get there when these various people, they figure out this thing and they finally get this answer from this machine. What's the meaning of life? And the answer is 42, which was a little disappointing. But they realize that they don't actually know what the question was, right? That the answer is 42, but they forgot kind of what the question was. This is how it happens in the story. Well, I always think of that when I think of this, like the Bible has all this stuff to say, but we've forgotten to ask the most important questions of it. We're just asking like, you know, how do I, you know, think about this particular, you know, political situation maybe, or how do I worship in a, you know, religious way? And those are all a million good questions we could ask, but we're not asking the questions that it's primarily seeking to ask. What is the nature of reality? How do you know things? What's the good and the true and the beautiful? And how do you live in relationship with each other? And once you start asking those questions, it's like the Bible comes alive. It's like there's so much there that we've overlooked. And then finally, I do think we've really limited our witness to the world in losing this idea that Christianity is offering a whole philosophy of life. Right? And especially as I think about just the increasingly polarized age we live in, increasingly post-Christian culture, what we're experiencing here, not as much in Texas, although it's getting there, we're just 30, 40 years behind what's happened in Europe and what's going to happen other places as well. The kind of influence Christianity will have in society will diminish. It's okay. I don't think you should be anxious about it. It's actually, the church usually does pretty well when we're not in power, to be honest with you. Although I like the general Christian influence on our culture, but I think part of the way that we have limited our witness is that we have kind of talked about and thought about our Christianity in this too narrow of a way and not realized it's actually offering people an incredible vision for how to live a really flourishing life. I think you especially see this with 18-year-olds who maybe go off to college. Some of you were that not too long ago, probably. And they discover a lot of wisdom and a lot of goodness in life that has nothing to do with what their Christianity was told to be, right? But what if we thought about Christianity as true and talked about it, which is what the Bible is doing, as a comprehensive and beautiful, flourishing way of inhabiting the world? I think that would really strengthen our own experience and also our witness to the world, right? So, what are the gains if we rediscover this? And then I'm going to take a pause, see if you have any questions. I think it helps us mainly read the Bible in a deeper way, recognizing again that it is a thoughtful and sophisticated whole life vision. Now, in the book, which I hope maybe you'll read, the first half of the book is me just kind of unpacking what this idea of the Bible's philosophy and unpacking that a little bit more than I've done just now. And then the second half of the book, I take three big topics that ancient philosophers cared about and that you and I care about, and I say, what does the Bible have to say about these philosophical issues? And particularly they are emotions, which I want to talk about here more for a minute, relationships, and happiness. And I try to show that those three topics were not only important to ancient people and important to contemporary people, but they were really important to the Bible. And the Bible has incredibly wise things to say about all those. But I want to, at this kind of point, I want to pause, because I love to dialogue, and I want to see what's coming up for you. Do you have any questions, especially clarification, because I just said a lot of new things. So I'm going to take a few minutes to do that, and then I want to talk about this issue of emotions a little bit more, and then we'll have some Q&A. So let's pause, though. I would love to hear from you. What's coming up for you? What questions do you have? Especially things like, awesome, I love that. Those are really good comments. But if you have pushback, that's all welcome as well. Any thoughts, questions so far from what I've said? Don't be shy. Yeah, please.
So practically, what does this look like? Do you think the church, the family, who should be the one to kind of push this worldview out?
Yeah, so what's this practically look like? I think that's part of what the second half is trying to do, just to say, like, on some really specific issues, to think about them from a biblical and Christian philosophical perspective that we may not have before. Like emotions, which we'll talk about here in a minute, is a good example. Like, how do you think about what your emotions are and how to deal with them? Where are you getting that wisdom? Right? Probably from some popular book, right? Which doesn't mean it's bad, but is it really there? So I think it starts with us thinking about specific aspects of our lives and retooling them individually and in our local communities. But maybe I'm not answering your question.
Sure,
do you want to?
I didn't ask it.
It's okay.
So you're saying it starts with the individual, it starts with how we think and like where we.
And the small communities that we're in, yeah, right.
And then practically, like kids grow up, they go to school, they learn different philosophies.
Yeah.
How in the home practically do you kind of see that worldview getting pushed to them?
Yeah.
Kind of show them how to think.
Yeah, I think you're getting right at it. I think if we adopt a mindset that the Bible actually is offering this same kind of thing, and not just the Bible's the religious part of your life, or the Bible's the stuff you better don't lose the Bible or something, right, as you go out into the world, but instead say, hey, you're going to, depending on the age of the kid, as you're going off to college or wherever it is, you're going to be encountering things that people say about what the nature of happiness is, or what the nature of relationships, or how to handle your emotions. I'm wanting to be showing you over years that actually that's exactly what the Bible and the Christian faith has a lot to say about. You don't have to go to other places. I mean, you can go to other places because there's wisdom in the world everywhere, right? There's lots of good in non-Christian thinking about a lot of things. But it's always, coming back to Scripture and seeing, wow, the Bible really has a lot of good to say in that. So I think it's having an attitude in your home of not anxiety, but instead beauty. Just to recognize, what we've tried to do with our kids very imperfectly, right? So I have 6 kids, 25 down to, I'm not sure how old they are.
17.
I think 16, right? I think one of them 16. Yeah, she just got her license, right? So anyways, thank you, Becky. You should travel around with me so you can answer this question for me. But yeah, 25 down to 16, I think. And they are, we've tried very imperfectly to cast a vision for them by how we live and how we talk of not anxiety about their faith or anxiety about the world, but to say, the Bible is really rich and the Christian faith is really strong and beautiful and has wisdom that will guide your life. And I do think a lot of it has to do with the attitude we have. And it's really hard with kids when you see them. I have a lot of anxiety about, I can think of a couple of my kids that I don't, especially young adults. Having little kids is really hard, but I'm sorry if you're in that little stage, it actually only gets harder. You're more tired at this age, but the emotional burdens of young adult children, which you all did to your parents, by the way, whether you realize that or not, as you were who am I going to marry? Where am I going to live? What job? From a parental perspective, those are really hard things to see your kids go through. I know you didn't realize that when you were doing it because you were just doing it, but to just have a vision. So I feel a lot of anxiety about, my kids at different stages on these kind of things, but to just keep coming back to this idea that the church is not fragile and that the faith is not fragile and that no one ever outgrows the wisdom of the Bible, right? You only think you do for a little while, but when you come back and get on your knees before God in Holy Scripture, you will find a sufficient philosophy of life that is going to bless you and guide you in ways that you couldn't even have imagined, right? So I know those are kind of abstract answers. It's hard. Yeah. So I gave an equally broad answer. There you go. But no, I appreciate the question. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah.
In our modern translations of Scripture, we see Jesus' disciples referring to him directly as teacher.
Yeah,
So I'm just curious,
that's what that meant, philosopher.
Okay, I was wondering, is that a direct translation, philosopher, teacher?
Basically.
Same, or why did they choose one word versus the other in our translation?
Yeah, it basically, to call him a teacher or a rabbi even really is, what that would have meant to them is someone who is modeling for us and teaching us how to inhabit the world in a way that will promise true human flourishing. That really is what it meant. For us, when we think of teacher, we think someone who knows a bunch of stuff and does a good job talking about it, right? Which is fine, but that for them, teacher, philosopher, rabbi meant an embodied person who lives well, who has wisdom that can help me learn to be wise. And that's why the followers of a philosopher are called disciples, right? Which is actually a Greek term that Aristotle and all of them used to refer to their students who would literally live with them and do their music and their gymnastics and their metaphysics and everything together. Those were called disciples. There aren't any disciples in the Old Testament, you notice, right? That's a New Testament Greek philosophical term for Greek people in the first century to understand, oh, that's what Jesus was. He was a philosopher who said some pretty crazy stuff, but he was a philosopher who, that's why people followed him around and gave their lives to him, because they were trying to learn to live like he did. That whole, I know for us, we don't think of it that way, but for them, it would have been very clear in the first century, that's how Jesus is being presented, as a philosopher who's making disciples, right? So, yep.
So about that, what's happening within our culture that's minimizing Christ as philosopher too? It's not as prominent
Yeah. So what happened? Why did we stop talking that way, even though that was ubiquitous throughout most of the church's history? Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I deal with it a little bit in the book. One thing that happened is that philosophy itself changed. And so philosophy in the 18th century, especially and later, became disconnected from living a good life. And it did become about, does a chair exist when I leave the room, right? That kind of thing. And so it got disconnected. And it's interesting, already in the 18th century, you see people, and earlier in this 17th century as well, you see philosophers begin to complain about this, that they're recognizing, wait a minute, we're not doing what philosophy really is. We're not living a philosophy of life. We're just talking about ideas. But then once you get into the modern university in the 19th century, especially in Germany and beyond, you have some incredibly brilliant philosophers. I mean, I could give you all these names, Heidegger and all. They're brilliant people, but it is now solidified that doing philosophy has nothing to do with actually living a moral life. It's like it becomes a scientific part of the university system. So the first thing that happens is philosophy changes. So that's why it's weird to say Jesus is a philosopher, because what we think of as, you mean he's a weirdo professor up in some room or something, right? So that's why it was hard to convince the publisher to keep that title. But if you will join with me, we can reclaim this word, right? This is what I buy many copies, makes a great stocking stuffer, right? So so that's the first thing that happens. The whole idea of philosophy itself changes. I think the other thing that happened was that in our tradition, in Protestantism, because we were birthed out of a protest, hence the name, the protest meant that the protest was against some misunderstandings of how we relate to God. Right? That's what the Protestant Reformation is. We relate to God not through various modes of works that earn favor, right? So that's what our heritage was saying. No, that's not true. That's good. I'm a Protestant for that reason. But the problem with our tradition is that we've tended to narrow down and reduce our understanding of what Jesus is about only to that issue. That it's the Jesus' message is just we can have a relationship with God through him through faith, not through works. That's 100% true. It's just not the whole message of the Bible. I mean, the Bible is saying a lot of other things too, right? Especially in the Gospels, right? But I think everywhere in the epistles too. So I think it's for us as Protestants, because really for the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, they still think of Jesus as a philosopher. I mean, they may not say that because the word philosopher has changed, but they never lost this. It's mostly in our tradition that we've lost this because we, again, I think have kind of narrowed down our understanding of what Jesus is about to only being his saving work and not his model for life. And it's a both and, it's not an either or, right? But we need both of those. And I think all you gotta do is read the Gospels. I mean, if all that mattered was his death and resurrection, which is absolutely central, if all that mattered, why do we need all the stories about his life, right? Why would that really matter? All his teachings about that. Just believe and you're good, right? The reason we have all these stories that show what he taught about how to live and the model of how he lived is because he's a sage that's teaching us how to live as disciples, right? So I hope that helps. Yeah, good question. Maybe, one.
Yeah, in terms of engagement in the world, I've been thinking of the approach of natural law as like the base of appeal to segue into things that are more of like the divine wisdom, that of revelation as the ultimate higher good, especially in regards to public policy type components. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that God having woven wisdom into the world, this can be a place to start. I'd be curious, how would you change or correct that framework?
Wow. Got a colleague who's totally into natural law, so hopefully he won't watch this. We're going to do a Q&A here at the end, and I'll have Drew maybe speak to that as well. I'll punt that to him a little bit. But I think I don't use the phrase natural law very much, but I do think there is wisdom that is baked into the world of the way things are that we can learn from. And if that's what we mean by natural law, that's great. But one of the things that I grew in the last 5 years of working on this kind of thing is to recognize, especially from an Israeli scholar named Yoram Hazony that Drew turned me on to recognize that the Bible's view on kind of government and relationship of humans to governmental structures and society and the environment and all that, we don't only have natural law stuff that we can discern. The Bible actually has a lot to say about that. It's remarkable how much that is an explicit topic, because that's a topic that humans need to understand. It's a philosophical idea that humans need to structure themselves with. And so I mean, yeah, I'm all for figuring out from economics or whatever their manifestations of common grace or natural law help us figure out things. But I think there's a lot more in the Bible that actually is guiding those principles that we can get straight from the revealed text as well. But there are two books of Revelation, right? There's the Bible and nature as well. I'd certainly affirm that.
Sort of approach.
Sorry?
Like in Romans 1 sort of approach into like, it's evident here in creation.
Yeah.
Unless there's something more than leading back into hopefully some sort of evangelization.
Yeah, that's good. It's a both and. I think there's wisdom. And that's why I've already mentioned that. I think there's a ton of wisdom in non-Christian thinkers and institutions even a lot of times. And I don't think we need to be afraid of that. I mean, I read all kinds of books from all kinds of people. The metaphor I always like to use is I'm out there gathering wood from any forest I can find. Now I'm running the sawmill as the Holy Scripture, right? Or the architect or the blueprint is like, is this wood going to work in this house that Holy Scripture is guiding me to build, But there's good wood, lots of places, and you just have to be discerning about it, right? And I think you could use that analogy to say, yeah, there's tons of good in just understanding how a great economist thinks about this or that or whatever, apart even from specific verses that teach us that. So, okay, if you don't mind, let me go on to the next thing. I'm gonna have to do this quickly because I want to give us some other time, but thank you for those great questions. So if you look in the second half, and again, since you have the book, which is great, you'll be able to go back to this, but I just wanted to say a little bit about emotions, because for me, this was a very emotional topic, but it is, that was a joke. But for me, this is the most shocking thing I learned over the last 5 years of working on this project was that, you think emotions, like who, you're telling me Aristotle talked about emotions? Yeah, he did. Because they cared about how do you live well and experience human flourishing. And guess what? Depending on where you are in the Enneagram or not, it doesn't matter. We are all driven by emotions. Anxiety, fear, shame, hope, love, joy or joylessness. If you start being really honest and paying attention, and sometimes you have to retool how you think, emotions are driving basically everything we do, right? And so the ancient people realized this, and so they talked very thoughtfully about emotions. And so what I do, I'll do a super quick version of it here. What I do is kind of run through what the ancient people said about emotions, and there was a debate about them, and then just look for a moment and ask, if the Bible is a philosophy as well, does it have anything to say about emotions? Well, it turns out it has a remarkably sophisticated, nuanced, thoughtful way to teach us about our emotions. So I call this educating our emotions, but the point is basically our emotions are affecting us in every way. I mean, all the time, as I was just saying. And just kind of a key principle of life and flourishing is that if we aren't aware of and learn to address our emotions, they're actually going to continue to affect us. There's things are going to come out sideways. So it's not a matter of whether emotions shape your life. It's whether you learn to become aware of them and learn to educate them in certain ways. So they are ever present. And, for time's sake, I'm not going to be able to do all this, but I think one of the best of the many, many great Pixar movies is Inside Out, which, of course, deals with what's going on inside. Have we all seen this? I think probably. If not, it's a good one to go watch again. It's very interesting because, this is one of the great things about Disney Plus, that we can go back and watch all these. I'm so glad to have like 19 different streaming services now. It's really a total joy. But if you haven't seen it, bit of a spoiler alert here, but on the other hand, if you haven't, I don't know what you're doing with your life, so sorry, not sorry. But the Inside Out title refers to the way in which the story goes back and forth between what's going on the outside of this 11-year-old girl, Riley, I think is her name, and what's going on inside of her. And of course, inside of her, there are these 5 emotions, which are based on a certain theory of emotions that I don't think is quite right, but it's fine enough for this. The 5 emotions are joy, sadness, fear, disgust, and anger. And of course, they're perfectly cast with Amy Poehler and Phyllis Smith, and Mindy Kaling. I mean, they did just such a great job on this, right? And not only is the story just really engagingly told, and you have some great moments of laughter. Remember when Anger's reaction to California broccoli pizza, right? And he says, "Congratulations, San Francisco, you've ruined pizza," right? So great moments like that. But more profoundly, like any good narrative, it's actually functioning at several levels. Kids can watch it and enjoy it, but when you watch it as an adult, you realize, oh, right, there's another layer of wisdom and kind of heart that's going on here. And at one climactic scene, Riley, you may recall, she's overwhelmed with anger and disappointment and hurt, and she's getting on a bus to run away. And if you remember that part, the emotions console goes completely gray, and they can't affect it. And I've long thought that's a really powerful image of depression, really, and just that you can get to a point where even you don't feel anything, right? And that's a very scary part. And what happens very wisely and some of you have experienced that, I know many. What happens in the movie, you may recall, is that she cannot kind of be prevented from running away until she doesn't find joy that makes her come alive. And this is kind of the point, but she actually gets connected also with sadness. And this is part of the profound point of the story, is that to be a fully flourishing and human person involves all of the emotions. Like when she's a little kid, she thinks, to whatever she's self-conscious, and her parents think that to be alive is to be only full of joy. And this is a big part of if you've never thought about what the story was trying to say, it's trying to say that to be human is to actually have the full gamut of emotions in your life. Right? That's a pretty profound, thank you, Pixar. Way to go, humanity. I mean, that's some good natural law or good common grace wisdom. And then, of course, the fun part is at the end is that, she enters puberty and they get this new console, right? If you remember. But anyways, so I open with this sort of inside out, because it is, I think, a very insightful approach to the complex reality of human emotions. But as I said, turns out that it's not just modern people that have thought carefully and deeply about this. The ancient philosophers did as well. And there's more than I have time to say, and you can read the book if you're interested in these chapters. But basically, in the ancient world, there was a big debate about what exactly emotions are, and the different philosophical systems, because they had different metaphysics, they had different views of what exactly emotions were. So on the one side, the Platonic side, you have this very non-cognitive, it's often called, view of emotions, that emotions are this negative thing, mostly, that the picture is that you've got the human soul is here, and he's got two different things competing against him to find life or to be able to go forward. One is passions, which are kind of uncontrollable emotions, and the other is reason or cognition. And so this is one view it's a metaphysical view. It's a view of humanity that we consist of these two parts, basically. One is this rational part, and it's in competition with this passionate part, right? And so the key is to, learn to control the emotions to some degree with the passions with the mind. But not everybody viewed it that way as well. There's also this Aristotelian tradition, which is often called a cognitive tradition, that emphasizes that emotions are actually the response to cognition. Okay, so there's some perception that results in some emotional view. And this is an illustration I came up with, and that is that how do you feel about these two pictures? Well, it all depends on a whole bunch of stuff. That's going on cognitively. Like for most of us, I guess I'll speak for many people, we would enjoy a good steak, right? Because of commitments in our minds and experiences that we've had with our bodies and our minds of the goodness of this. And if someone said, hey, we're going out for a steak dinner, if you have positive emotions for that, that's based on thoughts and experiences you have that are positive. And so the emotion is the idea is a response to that conceptualization, right? Unless you're a vegetarian, and then maybe this brutally murdered slab of cooked blood meat does not sound appealing to you. Well, that's because of a set of cognitive. Your emotions about this are very different than my emotions about this because of certain commitments up here, right? As opposed to if I was, hey, we're going out to a restaurant and having a pile of bricks, right? Well, that's not going to evoke the same thing because of thoughts. However, if there's floodwaters coming up to your house and somebody arrives not with a pile of steaks, but with a pile of bricks, you're going to have a different emotional response. So this is a super simple version of it, but the idea is this is Aristotle's kind of view that emotions are a response to a perception, right? Bodily, but especially cognitively. And it's more complicated than this, but these are the kind of the two big categories. And the whole point of the ancient philosophical systems in so many ways was that you need to learn, whether it's one view or another, you need to learn how to control or educate your emotions, depending on what they are, how you perceive them to be, so that you can live a good life. Otherwise, you're just going to be doing whatever, right? And there's no life in just being hedonistic and just doing whatever you want, right? So the dominant view of emotions that comes into being philosophically in the couple hundred years before Jesus and lasts into the couple hundred years after Jesus is a pretty dominant view. I mean, it's the popular view. It gets popularized. They had a good marketing campaign and everything, was what was called Stoicism. Now, not everybody was a Stoic, but they were probably the most popularized. They were the Oprah kind of people of the day. They were very thoughtful people as well. Not that Oprah's not thoughtful, I'm sure she is, but these were actual philosophers. But they promoted this view of emotions that kind of comes out of the Aristotelian tradition, but it's a little different as well. And basically what the Stoics said was that emotions are part of life. They can't be avoided completely, but the key to happiness was to learn to not let them really affect you in very significant ways. And how you do that is you go through exercises every day, like remember that you're going to die, and when you're putting your kids to bed, kiss them goodnight, and remember they're probably going to be dead pretty soon, right? Way to go, Stoics. But the reason they did this is because they say you will train yourself to not have emotional reactions to situations so that you can be kind of centered and then you can show up in life well. Or they'll say things like, when you're offended at something or when you feel injured, that's almost entirely, or if not entirely, some of them would say, what you perceive about the situation, it's not because you actually were wronged. It's how you perceive that you were wronged. And so you go through these exercises to basically minimize the effect of the emotions on your life. And that's why we still, if someone shows up very non-emotionally, we might say they're a Stoic, right? That's why we say that still. Now their actual views were more nuanced than that, right? I mean, they did recognize emotions aren't all bad, et cetera. But so I give you this, maybe you've seen something like this, it's pretty funny, this Darth Vader, that's one way to think about Stoicism. Not entirely fairly, but, angry, happy, sad. This is a little set of coins that some Dallas area friends bought me that are actually Stoicism coins that you can buy, because there's a kind of a Stoic movement today. Just down in Austin is the main leader of it, a guy called Ryan Holiday. And I actually like Stoicism a lot. I think there's a ton of wisdom in it. I always describe it as the second greatest philosophy of the world after Christianity, because practically it really does help you live well. I think to kind of take agency and responsibility for your own life, including your emotions, seek to be a virtuous and good person. I mean, you read the Stoics, which I do every day, there's actually a lot of wisdom in them. I think ultimately it's a bankrupt system metaphysically. There's no reason for hope. They have trouble dealing with real suffering and pain because they just kind of write it all off. But there's still a lot of wisdom in it. And you can buy these little Stoicism coins that remind you of the principles of Stoicism. And I was teaching on this some years ago, and some friends bought those for me as a joke/love, I'm not sure. But anyways, so the question then to wrap this up for us is, what does the Bible have anything to say about emotions? Well, it turns out it does. So the ancient philosophers did. Today, it's mostly psychologists and others that can be very helpful. But what is the Bible? If the Bible's actually a really practical whole life philosophy, it better deal with emotions. I don't know if you've asked yourself that question. Well, it turns out the Bible has a really powerful, beautiful, and I think the best philosophy of emotions that you can find anywhere. And the short version of it is, and you can read the chapter in the book, is that it encourages us to embrace the whole realm of our emotions. The middle of the Bible is a huge emotional songbook where it's not just joy. We call it the Psalter. It's not just joy. It's every emotion is there. Anger, fear, sadness, joy, hope, regret, right? And it turns out, and I don't have time to get into it today, but it turns out the Bible talks a lot about God having emotions, which can be misunderstood, but in a number of ways. But he actually loves us. I mean, if you don't think that God has emotions in the sense that you think that he doesn't really feel anything in the sense that we can say that, then I don't know what you think it means for him to love you as a father, because that involves an emotion, right? Now, we can't get into all this, and I'll let the real theologians in the back figure out how to talk about God's impassibility in the correct way, and if not, I'll correct you on it. But we can get back to that. But Jesus clearly has emotions, right? And he's the God-man, and that's not just part of his humanity. And then you start thinking about the New Testament and the whole Bible, and how many of the commands are actually rooted in having a certain kind of emotion. Let's just think about the fruit of the Spirit. Love. You may say, well, love's a verb, not an emotion. Okay, yeah, how's that working out in your marriage? So no, love involves an emotion. Joy, peace. I mean, that I think can be understood in this sort of inner tranquility sense. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Some of those are directly emotions. Some of them are clearly rooted in emotional ideas. But then what is the first and second greatest commandments for humanity from God? To love God and to love others. And again, that's more than an emotion, but it's not less than an emotion. Right? You ever hear the old classic John Piper line, which I love, where he talks about, like, if you were to show up at your house, and so you're married, and you show up at your own house on your anniversary with flowers, you knock on the door, and your spouse, or we'll say your wife, the husband shows up, and he offers flowers, and she says, "Oh, you shouldn't, that's so good." And he said, "It's okay, it's my duty." Right? Well, you did the right thing, but what's lacking there? What's lacking is the emotion, right? And you think about the centrality of the commands for us to have compassion on others. That's an emotion. Right? So the point is, the Bible affirms and welcomes us, especially in the Psalter, that all of our emotions are part of what it means to be human. Inside out's kind of onto something there. But then it also invites us over time to learn to educate our emotions in certain ways. Right? And the primary ways we are told to educate our emotions, to have them be shaped by the power of the Spirit, are through reflection and through prayer. Reflection is where you use your mind and your experiences to reflect on what is true of God, so that over time, it's not a quick fix, we might have things like anxiety never go away. We're always going to have anxiety. Anxiety is not a sin. Okay? Somebody tells you that, they're not being helpful. The vision of anxiety in the Bible is not like you're bad if you have it. It's instead an invitation, add to that anxiety a counterweight of hope. But God never tells us, don't you cry, even though your dad may have told you that. That's not God the Father. He's not saying, don't show emotions. The whole Psalter is full of emotions. It's just saying, in the midst of this reality of being a human who has emotions like Jesus himself did, over time learn to add to that the hope and consolation and faith, which is not in competition with those things, but it's a way to kind of educate and shape and flavor and color those real human emotions. And then the other way is through prayer, and particularly, and this is why ultimately I think Stoicism, which I love in so many ways, doesn't work, is that I think the two most powerful, the two most fundamental emotions for humans are fear and shame. And the Bible is so clear that those primary emotions that we experience are best processed in the presence of God. That there is actual forgiveness available, no matter how bad of a thing you've done and are doing, and the shame you feel from it, both social shame and also personal psychological shame, there is actually forgiveness available through confession. This remarkable thing that you can just say to God, this is true of me and I need forgiveness. And that is actually a powerful emotional experience. It's not a quick fix, but it does really bring release. And also, one of my favorite verses of the Bible, cast your anxieties upon the Lord, for he cares for you. This, in other words, in every way, the philosophy of the Bible, God himself, is not telling you not to have emotions. It's saying, learn to find true happiness and flourishing and joy, even in the midst of the complexity of living as a human full of emotions. You can learn to be shaped to experience the true happiness you long for, the life you long for, by letting Holy Scripture shape our sense of what it means to be human and what it is to mean to have these emotions. Okay, so that's the short version of that. There's more in the book. I do want to pause because we're going to get you guys out of here by noon. We only have 15 minutes, but we thought we'd take a few minutes for questions on that or anything. And I wanted to invite my dear friend Drew Johnson up here. So Drew is a professor at King's College in New York City, longtime friend of mine. We were here in town co-teaching a class the last couple of days at Southwestern on pedagogy. And we both have been deeply involved in this idea of the Bible as philosophy. I've learned more from him than he's learned from me, I'm sure. But he's written many, many books that I often use as textbooks in my classes, but including his latest book is called The Biblical Crap.
It's 16 years old. That's all I know.
What's it called?
I don't know. It's
The Bible as philosophy?
What?
No, come on. What is it called? Biblical philosophy. Actually, we just met. I've never heard this. So biblical. So
Very secret. Authors don't get to name the.
That is
title.
true. We get the subtitles sometimes, not the titles.
Not the title.
Yeah. So, anyways, he has done more work, especially on the Hebrew Scripture. He goes to Israel all the time. He's very connected. He runs a Center for Hebraic Thought that is basically the whole point is the Bible's a whole life philosophy. That has Jewish people involved and Christians. I'm one of the fellows there. So he has written a lot of books and does a lot of the same kind of stuff. So I thought, well, while he's here, we can just maybe both take some shots. So we only have about 12 minutes or so, but we'd be happy to take some questions about anything I've said or anything more broadly. So, yeah, Kyle.
I've got a question to start. If Jesus is the epicenter of philosophic thought in the New Testament, right, as far as the biblical story goes, who's the epicenter of philosophic thought in the Old Testament?
Great question.
I would say the epicenter of
Jesus. It better be.
Of philosophy in the Bible is not Jesus. I think it's the Torah, because Jesus constrains his teaching to the Torah. He sees his teaching as flowing naturally from the Torah, extending all the philosophical thought of the Torah into his present context.
So you're saying Jesus isn't a philosopher?
No, I'm saying he's not the philosopher. So if that's the case, then Yahweh is actually the philosopher, the first one who creates a community of philosophy, a philosophical community. And going back to Deuteronomy 4, the purpose is not for me to be ethical; it's for us to be a wise and discerning nation who proliferates justice and righteousness into the world, which I think is a natural extension into exactly everything he's describing here. Which is why Jesus doesn't pick one Obi-Wan to Luke ratio, but he creates a community, as many people have said. He didn't write a book, he created a community.
That's good. Good. Yeah.
What pragmatically do you do in your life to kind of evoke the sense of being a lover of wisdom from like a daily habitual standpoint? Either one of you or both of you.
What was the question? Sorry, I assumed you were
I
talking to
didn't
him.
frame it well.
What do you do to?
In your daily life, what are some habits? I'm sure prayer and
Yeah.
reading of the word certainly is part of that. But is there specific things that you would impart to us in your quest for wisdom and following after the Lord?
Yeah, I'll just answer briefly. I do think a lot about emotions and pay attention to what's going on and then process that through this kind of biblical emotional thing because it affects us so much. And also I'll steal probably what Drew would say is, because I've learned a lot of this from him, is I think about what I do with my body and how what I do with my body in terms of posture and health and habits, those things shape my way of seeing the world as well, right? And so those are a couple of things. I think a lot about emotions and I think a lot about my body and what I try to do with it. I think a lot about my body. That's what I would say.
I think a lot about body too.
I just mean what we do with our physical embodiment is what I mean. So
And I think with Scripture, I actually daily encountering the Word. I now actually encourage a lot of people to quit reading the Bible daily, and actually read it the way it's meant to be read, and often actually to get in communities where you listen to the Bible being read, because I think that's the natural habitat of Scripture. That's how it was written. It's in order to be read not as individuals alone in private, but as to be heard in the community and discussed that way. But I also would encourage a lot of people, if you don't know Scripture really well and you can't kind of do biblical theology on your own on the fly, reading a paragraph and trying to squeeze that stone for the blood of nourishment of God every day seems like a hopeless task to me. So I'd rather have my students who don't know Scripture that well, I'm like, I'd rather have you read Matthew 3 times this weekend and develop better questions every time you read it. You will have a much more profound understanding of Scripture by taking the same amount of time that you would spend over the weekend doing that, and putting those questions back to God and asking Him to reshape you, than you would by reading a paragraph of Matthew every day for the next month. And then once you get that kind of grasp, then you can dip in and move and jump into parts of Romans. But the irony to me is that I'm going to diatribe soapbox for a second. Since I built no credibility and I came up blindly, I'm just going to borrow the soapbox.
Assume credibility.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm assuming
I gave him some good intro.
yes.
That helps, right? Yeah.
All the epistles are sermons, which were meant to be read as sermons and heard as sermons in one shot. So the idea that we take them and microdose them week by week, where people don't actually, if you say, I'm going to preach on 1 Peter, if you don't actually know what Peter says in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's difficult for me to make sense of how you would understand the thing that I'm going to teach about 1 Peter 2, and you are called to suffer, right? And Peter's larger theology. If that's your only exposure to Scripture, any kind of thoughtful exposure to Scripture that week. So that figuring out disruptive ways to read Scripture so that it actually disrupts your thinking and becomes deep learning, I think is one trick. The other one too is I live in Newark, New Jersey. I work in New York City, but I live in Newark, which is only 5 miles west of my office. But in New York, you can't say the New York metropolitan area if you live in New Jersey. But we spent a lot of time in the housing projects. That was our friendship project for our church. And so working, hanging out with kids, bringing them into our house, spending time with them. I think if you're not doing things for the vulnerable people in your community, which will look different in different communities, I don't understand how you could ever possibly understand the gospel in its fullness. I don't see that as a possibility. So I'd say getting your body into action and working with the vulnerable in your community. And there's lots, that can look a lot of different ways. I live in Newark, so there's no lack of physical and psychological poverty. But if I lived in a suburb, a wealthy suburb, there's no lack of psychological, sociological poverty, hurt, trauma, etc. So,
Don? Yeah.
So, other than the fact that knowing that Jesus is a Torah rabbi, when I look at the New, particularly the Gospels, where do I see his metaphysical viewpoints?
Yeah, I think the way he speaks about the kingdom, I think, is probably the easiest entry point. With all the parables and other teachings he does about the kingdom, I would put that as a metaphysical claim. I think he is assuming Genesis, and he affirms that, and so a creationist kind of view of reality. He's a realist. He thinks there's a real world and there's mystery. So all that he affirms from the Hebrew Scriptures, but I think particularly his metaphysic emphasizes this coming reality and what it's going to look like, and is inviting us to learn to inhabit the world in alignment with that kingdom of heaven. And that's how I would say that. If you start looking at the parables, read them through, not only parables, but all of Jesus' teaching, read them through a metaphysical standpoint, asking what does this say about reality and and read them politically. How does this say about how relationships should be? What does this say about how, what God values and who God is and what humanity is? All those big questions, and they're like, oh, that's exactly what they're doing, I think, largely. So
yeah, I think if you go down one layer into the soil of what he's saying is when Jesus is making the assumption or outwardly saying things were not so in the beginning, metaphysically speaking. So creation was dirt and carpet, well, not carpet, but it was stuff, and it somehow got disordered metaphysically. It's the same stuff, it's material, what we call material world, but it somehow got distorted. We are presently experiencing a corrupted, broken, fractured, distorted version of reality, both psychically and physically. And he always looks forward to what he considers a political kingdom, the empire of God, which is going to reorient the material world back to the right way it's supposed to be, as Tom Wright likes to say, to put things back to rights, right?
That's metaphysics.
Those are all
right?
metaphysical
Right,
claims.
yeah.
And those are metaphysical claims that entail a particular metaphysical flow of reality.
It's good.
So it's
I
a
agree.
great question.
Yeah, it
I don't
is
think
good.
I would have thought of it until I started reading his stuff too.
Yeah.
I've heard the word for word in John 1
Hmm.
is very a loaded Greek
Yeah.
philosophical term, and so
Logos, yeah,
yeah,
right.
and
Yeah.
so I don't know much about that other
Mhm.
than what I just said to you. So
Yeah, no, it's good. It's great. No, it's good.
much of that.
Yeah, that's good.
So can you tell me more?
Yeah, just real briefly, I think John 1 is this incredibly brilliant picture of the universality of the reality of the Christian faith and the reality of Jesus, in that it simultaneously affirms the story of Genesis 1 on, and the fact that creation is something that God himself spoke, logos, right? So it affirms that, and also adds some crucial element that word became flesh. Whoa, that's a shock. But so there's something unexpected, but it's still affirming the creationist account, right? And at the same time, it's speaking right into, because that's a key word for the Greek philosophical system as well, that logos basically means the structure of the universe and the blueprint of how things hold together. And to say that Jesus is that, it's like simultaneously affirming and transforming what anybody, a Jew or a Greek, would believe, right? It's this perfect, and I think when John had that moment, he was like, oh my, what can I, because the synoptics don't call him the Logos. I think when John's reading the synoptic tradition, he's sitting down to write, he's thinking, that's it. That was the way, I'm going to call him the Logos, in the sense that that's this perfect way of affirming and challenging both the Hebrew mindset that wouldn't include Jesus potentially as an incarnate, that's kind of shocking to most Jews, and the Greek mindset. So
Yeah, and I don't think you mentioned this here this morning, but it also reveals one of the most startling aspects of the Christian Hebraic philosophy, which is that it's available and expected of everyone. So John 1 is some of the most profound ancient philosophical tooling. I don't even know what to call it.
Yeah.
But it's also written in vulgar Greek, and it's misspelled and grammatically incorrect at spots, right? Or it has conflated spellings. And so John is both clearly not a master of the language of Greek, and yet laying out some of the deepest tracks and the deepest cuts you could imagine. So everything he said, and this goes both back into the Torah and the land in the world of the ancient Fertile Crescent, whether we're in Egypt or Mesopotamia, or whether we're in Greco-Roman societies. Everything that he just said and said, hey, this is open and available for us as Christians, none of that was open and available to anybody except the elites, right? And so the Torah comes in and says, no, teach this is your wisdom and discernment to your children as you walk along the way. You teach them this wisdom and discernment.
not just the people with PhDs, like anybody, right? Yeah.
To the man, to the woman, to the foreigner, to the native born. It's a totalizing system, and it's expected of everybody. So when Jesus comes on the scene in Luke 12 and he's yelling at farmers saying, hey, you know how to read meteorology? But you're hypocrites. Why don't you apply your skill of interpreting the clouds and the winds to what's going on right in front of you? He's actually tugging on that he believes they should, by embodying these principles from the Torah and learning this wisdom, this way of being in the world as a community, farmers, these weren't scribes and elites he was yelling at, these are farmers. That he believes that everybody should not only have access to this, but it's expected of everybody. So this has knock-on effects into everything from the fact that we're all literate in this room, right? That's not an accident. That doesn't happen.
That's a Christian
That is a
commitment.
deeply Christian
Yeah.
commitment. So
Right.
we're all literate, and that basic wisdom is expected of all of us.
Yeah, good question. Might just have time for one more. Yeah.
Do you see any danger, or how would you balance the idea of the Bible as primarily a self-help book, or a book for answers, like maybe one of the books you presented before?
Can you frame the first part of the question on it again?
Do
Or?
you see any danger? How would you balance the idea that the Bible is primarily about us, or how would you see, warnings to
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
for your answers specifically in the Bible?
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, everything's a both and, not an either or, right? And so I think it is, again, the Bible's more than philosophy of life. It is a revelation of God Himself to us, that, profoundly. But it's not less than that. Again, so it's holding together that both and. That'd be the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that it is, we're all, the role of teachers and leaders is to read the times and give the appropriate help, or think of it in medical doctor terms, it's to look at the symptoms and then give the appropriate medicine, right? As a soul doctor, right? And so this, I think, my point in this book, and I think a big part of our vision for both of us, is to kind of recapture something that we've lost. I don't think either of us would, I don't think you're saying this either, would say the Bible's a self-help book, but I do think probably in a lot of our circles and traditions, we've lost the part in which it is actually teaching us how to live a flourishing life. Like and that we're trying to kind of bring that part back in, not to replace the religious elements or replace the divine revelation elements, but to kind of balance it back out. I think that's fair. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, I think I would add that, that most of you probably already know this because you're in this community, but that most of the yous in Scripture, you do this, you shall do this, are actually y'all. So in Texas, you can get away. I'm from Oklahoma, so I can say that as well, right? But it really is about forming community. So self-help is communitarian help. It's, no person can be ethical according to the Torah or Jesus' teaching. It's actually communities that create the particular ethics that can flourish. So the self is part of the community help. So I think it buffers against this naturally. But I could see the danger in everything you said here. We hear that through self-help technologies, right? And so
Right.
Realizing that our self-help, the use of Scripture as self-help for us is only as good as the community we belong to, right?
That's good. Well, I just want to thank you again so much for coming out on a Saturday morning. What a delight to be with you, and I hope our paths cross again.